Somewhere in Havana right now, there's a Lada with over 400,000 kilometers on the odometer. It still starts every morning, and the owner has never replaced the engine. In Bulgaria, Serbia, and rural parts of Russia, mechanics who've spent 40 years working on these cars tend to say the exact same thing, almost word for word. They just don't die. And this isn't nostalgia. It's the result of a very specific engineering philosophy. Because to understand how that happened, you have to go back to one of the strangest industrial agreements of the Cold War. A moment when two ideologically opposed worlds sat across a table and decided to build something together. By the mid-60s, the Soviet Union had already put a man in space. It possessed the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth and operated heavy industry at a genuinely staggering scale. But if the average Soviet worker wanted to buy a car, they would probably have to wait 7 years. The numbers were brutal. In 1965, the Soviet Union produced around 200,000 passenger cars for a population of more than 230 million people. Meanwhile, Western Europe was already deep into mass motorization. In France, Germany, and Italy, families were beginning to buy cars the same way they bought refrigerators. Not exactly cheap, but realistically attainable. The Soviet leadership understood that this gap wasn't merely economic. It was visible, a constant reminder that the system still hadn't fully delivered what it had promised. And so, Leonid Brezhnev made a decision that sat uncomfortably within Soviet ideological logic: buy the solution from the West. In 1966, a Soviet delegation traveled to Turin to negotiate with Fiat, and Fiat wasn't chosen by accident. Renault had been considered. Volkswagen had also shown interest. But Fiat offered something fundamentally different. They weren't simply selling the design of a car. They were willing to build the entire factory, transfer industrial expertise, train Soviet engineers on site, and establish supply chains from the ground up. They weren't selling a vehicle. They were selling an entire industry. The estimated cost landed somewhere between $800 and $900 million in 1960s money. A figure so enormous that, according to multiple accounts, it caused discomfort even inside the Soviet Politburo. Spending that amount of foreign currency on capitalist technology was not exactly an ideologically comfortable position. That's where one of the most fascinating parts of this story begins. Cold War narratives usually portray both blocs as completely isolated systems and irreconcilable enemies. But reality was far more complicated. Fiat saw a massive contract and access to Eastern Bloc markets. The Soviets saw an industrial shortcut that would have otherwise taken decades to build themselves. For a brief moment, ideology stepped aside and made room for economics. And that happened far more often during the Cold War than history books usually admit. The car chosen as the foundation was the Fiat 124. Winner of the 1967 European Car of the Year award. On paper, it looked perfect. Modern styling, contemporary suspension, a reliable engine, and a platform already respected across Europe. The Soviet engineers looked at it and came to a fairly simple conclusion. This car would never survive a winter outside Moscow. There's a number that appears in almost every story about this project: 800. 800 modifications between the Fiat 124 and what would eventually become the VAZ-2101. And it's worth pausing on that figure for a second, because it's easy to hear it and move on without really considering what it means. These weren't 800 cosmetic tweaks. It wasn't about changing badges or redesigning the interior. Soviet engineers took the Fiat apart piece by piece and began questioning every assumption the Italians had made about roads, temperatures, fuel quality, and maintenance. Then, they rebuilt the car around entirely different answers. Ground clearance, for example. The Fiat 124 sat roughly 130 millimeters off the ground. perfectly reasonable for Italian roads. But outside major Soviet cities, many roads were still dirt, mud, or heavily damaged surfaces. So they raised the car to 170 millimeters. 40 millimeters that completely changed the relationship between the vehicle and the terrain it was actually going to live on. The body steel was reinforced. The structural geometry was redesigned to handle far harsher impacts and torsional loads. And the Fiat's rear independent suspension was replaced with a solid axle supported by 5 trailing arms. Less refined on perfect asphalt, far more durable everywhere else. Then there's the detail that probably explains the philosophy behind this entire project better than anything else: the hand crank. The VAZ-2101 was designed to be manually started from the front of the car. By the late 1960s, that already looked outdated in Western Europe. But the Soviets weren't thinking about technological elegance. They were thinking about mechanical survival. Because in Siberia, during January, batteries die. Starter motors fail, and the nearest help might be hundreds of kilometers away. So they designed the car assuming that sooner or later, the driver would find themselves completely alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere, and still need to get home. That wasn't outdated engineering, it was honest engineering, designing for the real user, in the real environment and under real conditions. And the engine is probably the most interesting part from a technical perspective. The original Fiat 124 used a relatively traditional pushrod design. Reliable, certainly, but already somewhat outdated by late 1960s European standards. Soviet engineers insisted on using an overhead camshaft design instead. According to several accounts, the Italians were skeptical. It was a more complex engine to manufacture, and Soviet industry had very limited experience with that kind of technology. But they built it anyway. The result was a 1.2-liter 4-cylinder, producing around 62 horsepower. Slightly more powerful than the original Italian version, featuring an aluminum cylinder head and a more advanced oil filtration system than many of its contemporaries. But power wasn't the point. The point was that the engine could survive on low-quality fuel while operating in temperatures ranging from -40 to +40 degrees Celsius, an 80-degree operating range. This wasn't an engine designed to impress people. It was an engine designed to stay alive. The factory built to produce this car deserves its own story entirely, because it remains one of the most impressive industrial projects of the 20th century, and yet, it's almost always reduced to a footnote. The chosen site was Tolyatti, near the Volga River, a city that had already been partially relocated years earlier after a hydroelectric dam flooded the original settlement. When Italian specialists arrived to inspect the area, several reports describe a remarkably similar reaction. This did not look like the future capital of an automotive industry. There was open steppe, minimal infrastructure, and a construction timeline that seemed outright impossible. The factory was completed in roughly 4 years. Tens of thousands of workers arrived from across the Soviet Union through organized labor programs, and the conditions were extremely harsh. Construction continued through full Russian winters under safety standards and production schedules very different from those in the West. And there's something important worth saying clearly here. Soviet megaprojects of this era carried a very real human cost. The construction of Tolyatti was a genuine industrial achievement, but the human price behind it was also extremely high. On April 19, 1970, the first VAZ-2101 finally rolled off the production line. 4 years from empty land to a fully operational automotive factory. Regardless of political perspective, the industrial scale of that achievement was difficult to ignore. Inside the Soviet Union, the VAZ-2101, nicknamed the Kopeyka, after the smallest Soviet coin, accomplished something no domestic automobile had managed at scale before. It made car ownership feel genuinely attainable for ordinary working families. That didn't mean it was easy to get one. Waiting lists remained a reality throughout the 1970s and much of the 1980s, but the Kopejka felt different from cars like the Moskvich or the Zaporozhets. It was more modern, mechanically solid, and above all, remarkably repairable. That last part wasn't accidental. The engine was accessible. Parts were standardized, and many repairs could be done using basic tools. In a country where authorized service centers were scarce outside major cities, that wasn't a minor convenience and was the difference between a useful automobile and an unmanageable problem. And it's also worth mentioning something official Soviet narratives often preferred to avoid. Access to these cars wasn't entirely equal either. Workplace allocations, personal connections, and regional availability heavily influenced who could actually get one. The Kopejka democratized car ownership in a very real sense. It dramatically expanded the number of people who could realistically aspire to owning a vehicle, but it still existed inside a system that was never fully neutral. Under the export name Lada, chosen partly because Zhiguli was difficult to pronounce in Western markets, the car began appearing in European dealerships during the 1970s, and the reception was far more complex than most people remember today. In the United Kingdom, Finland, Canada, and several parts of Europe, the sales pitch was incredibly simple. Low price, full warranty, and straightforward mechanics. It didn't compete with Volkswagen in refinement or BMW in prestige. It competed against used cars. And for a lot of people, that was enough. The car also achieved unexpectedly respectable moments in motorsport. Several VAZ-prepared variants performed solidly in rally competition, including a notable appearance at the 1971 Monte Carlo Rally. It didn't completely change Western perceptions of Soviet engineering, but it did force a lot of people inside the automotive world to take the car a little more seriously. Production of the original VAZ-2101 ended in 1982, but the platform continued evolving through the 2102, 2103, 2105, and 2107, surviving all the way until 2012. 42 years of production directly descended from that original foundation. More than 15 million vehicles built around the same mechanical philosophy. And perhaps most interestingly of all, the car ended up outliving the political system that created it. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Lada went from being a symbol of industrial modernization to, in many cases, becoming a symbol of post-Soviet hardship. By the 1990s, for many people across Eastern Europe, driving a Lada no longer represented progress. It represented whatever was still available, and yet they kept running. Today, the Kopejka occupies a strange and fascinating cultural position. Across Russia and Eastern Europe, entire communities are dedicated to restoring and preserving them. In Cuba, they never stopped being daily transportation. Alongside the famous pre-revolution American cars, Ladas became part of the urban landscape throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Many arrived through the political relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union, and even now, in 2026, they still move through Havana and other cities, maintained by mechanics who've spent decades learning exactly how to keep them alive. And in the West, perceptions have also changed over time. What spent years as the easy joke of the bad Soviet car has gradually been reevaluated by historians and enthusiasts who noticed something deeply uncomfortable. The Kopejka was designed to survive conditions that would have destroyed many European cars of the same era within only a few years. And by that standard, it didn't merely work. It survived far longer than almost anyone expected. Because in the end, the 800 Soviet modifications made to the Fiat 124 are usually framed as corrections, necessary patches meant to adapt a foreign car to difficult conditions. And yes, partly that's true. But that interpretation leaves out the most interesting part of the entire story. Every single one of those modifications was also a statement about what a car was supposed to be, not how it should look in a showroom. not how it should feel on a perfect road, but what it needed to do when temperatures dropped below freezing, the road disappeared, and the nearest mechanic was hundreds of kilometers away. That wasn't just technical adaptation. It was a complete design philosophy. And in a century full of automobiles built around advertising, status, and lifestyle aspirations, the Kopejka was built for something much simpler: to keep going.